Marcus Aurelius is one of the most romanticized monarchs in all of history.
Loyal servant to the true emperor, Marcus Aurelius.
Some have seen him as the embodiment of the philosopher king. Also, the philosophy that he espoused, Stoicism, has experienced a huge surge in popularity, such that now there are probably more Stoics in the world than there have been in the past 1.5 millennia. But was he really an enlightened ruler? And is Stoicism a philosophy that can hold up to the needs of the modern world? That's what we're going to find out today. Our guest today is a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist and a well known author on Stoicism, as well as the founder and president of the Plato's Academy Center in Athens, Greece. Donald Robertson, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
So, you've written 2 published books and 1 forthcoming book on Marcus Aurelius. Do you think he was an enlightened ruler?
Yes, I guess I do. It's difficult, obviously. I think it's hard to make a comparison between two completely different eras. There are obviously things about Roman society that are quite alien to our values today. It's a society built on the ownership of slaves, for a start, and where women's rights are not respected in the same way that they are today, and many other differences in values. But relative to the time in which he lived, yeah, I think Marcus Aurelius was one of the more enlightened rulers of the period.
Do you think that his study of Stoicism helped him manage the empire well?
His study of Stoicism definitely informed the way that he managed the empire. Um, I think there's kind of people have different perspectives on whether he did a good job of it or not. I think that he I mean, it might sound this might sound like an extreme position, but I think Marcus Aurelius um, potentially stabilized the northern frontier for a significant period of time, and prevented perhaps the Roman Empire from fragmenting and being overrun. So I think he did a really important job in preserving the empire. So did Cassius Dio. Actually, his main historian said that we have Marcus had many troubles throughout his reign, but we have to thank him for preserving the empire. He did an exceptional job in that regard.
So we have this romanticized picture of Marcus, that's reinforced by the movie Gladiator. He's up there in the north in the cold, with his soldiers fending off these hordes of Germanic barbarians. In reality, though, I mean,
Yeah,
all the good he did for the empire came at the expense of those Germanic tribes that he spent, decades mowing down to. I mean, you had these waves of invaders, and he just either slaughtered a lot of them or made them slaughter each other, and he
yeah.
did that so much that they no longer posed a threat to the empire. And maybe that was necessary in a kind of Machiavellian way, but if you're thinking of him as a philosophical Stoic ruler, does that really fit with his image as a Stoic philosopher?
Yeah, I think it does. Because I would characterize it very differently historically from the way that you characterized it. Um, so we're talking about a period of about 13 years for a start. And these wars began, the first Marcomannic War, to which you're referring, began because Rome was invaded by a coalition of tribes, mainly Germanic tribes, who crossed the Alps, and a barbarian army marched into northern Italy for the first time since Hannibal. And Marcus was obligated to liberate the north of Italy and the provinces, which were part of the Roman Empire, from a huge barbarian invasion, like a coalition of at least 10 separate barbarian tribes, probably more than that. And his problem at the time was that the Roman army had just finished a lengthy war in Parthia. So some of the troops were still stationed there. So the forces defending the northern frontier were quite depleted in that regard. And they were also depleted because of the initial outbreaks of a plague that's estimated to have killed up to 5 million people in the Roman Empire, called the Antonine Plague. And so the Germanic tribes saw this as an opportunity to attack and capture slaves, mainly was what they did. According to the Roman historians, they captured over 100,000 slaves from the provinces. And
Wow.
part of the reason that Marcus actually had to cross the border and attack the Germanic lands, and not only did he have to repel the German invasion, but then he had to continue the war for a period of time, according to the Roman histories anyway, in order to free the Roman subjects that had been captured and were being held prisoner in enemy territory. So I'd say that's what I'd say first of all in terms of characterizing the nature of the war. In terms of the way that Marcus fought that campaign, he was perceived at the time as being a military dove. The civil war that he had to fight subsequently was instigated by the more hawkish faction, who wanted to see a much more aggressive policy on the northern frontier. So Marcus had to fight a civil war because he was perceived as not aggressive enough. And the way that he fought that campaign put a lot of emphasis. He was engaged in a lot of battles, but he also placed a lot of emphasis on diplomacy and negotiation with the enemy tribes. Whereas I think the Roman generals that were opposed to him would have committed genocide, perhaps, or enslaved captured enemies in larger numbers.
Okay, that's a very eloquent defense of Marcus on that front. The other prong of the common criticism of Marcus Aurelius from his detractors is that he he failed to pick a good successor. He chose his son, thus ending the streak of five good
Yeah.
emperors. So how could like the most enlightened of the five good emperors end the streak? I mean, come on.
I mean, come on, what's going on? That is a common criticism. You're right. These are both good criticisms. They're both valid criticisms. I don't agree with either of these criticisms. But like, I don't hold a very rigid opinion on it. There's some justification for that conclusion. It's not the conclusion that I draw on balance, and I'll explain why. But first of all, there's a kind of cliche in ancient philosophy that you can't necessarily hold a teacher responsible for their student's behavior, or you can't necessarily hold a parent responsible for their child's behavior. And actually, the original example of that was Socrates, who had wayward students, and also there was unimpressive sons that weren't considered to be good for much. And people would say, "Well, Socrates, his sons weren't good for much, and his students caused a lot of political upheaval in Athens." And people would defend Socrates by saying, "Yeah, but you can't hold him entirely responsible for the behaviour of his students. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make it drink." Or as we would say today, genetics are an important factor in shaping personality, and like there are other factors in development apart from the role of the parent. Um, so there's that. Also as a parent myself, I feel like this is like somewhat unjust criticism. He's not the only person that influences Commodus's personality.
Yeah, but see, I'm not criticizing Marcus for failing to bring up Commodus in the best way or for failing to make Commodus into a great person. I'm saying, the streak of five good emperors was accomplished by not choosing your son as the successor. So why didn't Marcus, just make it a rule? I'm going to continue this.
Because he had a natural heir, and unlike his predecessors. And so if he'd disenfranchised Commodus by placing somebody else in control of the empire, then what would normally happen is that Commodus would have to be killed, because he would always pose a threat of civil war. And my argument basically starts from the premise that the Romans were more afraid of the threat of civil war than they were of the threat of a corrupt emperor, particularly Romans in the provinces, who often seem to have felt that they were relatively unaffected by bad emperors, but they were affected by outbreaks of civil war. And so, Marcus, the real question is, why did Marcus have children in the first place? But once he had a son, I think it would be difficult for him to appoint somebody else as Caesar, because Commodus would always be there in the wings as a potential rival, and people would potentially rally around him, and that would cause a schism in the empire and perhaps lead to civil war. In fact, what Marcus tried to do, he was the first emperor ever to introduce this idea of joint rule. It wasn't a complete novelty because the position of Roman emperor is made up of several powers and titles that can be, some of which can be shared or they can be assumed at different times. And in fact, Marcus himself was given many of those powers many years before he assumed the title of Augustus after Antoninus Pius, his predecessor, died. So Marcus was almost a co-emperor ruling alongside Antoninus Pius. But certainly when Marcus took the throne after Pius had died, he immediately insisted that Lucius Verus, his adopted brother, be appointed co-emperor alongside him and given similar powers on the model of the Roman consuls, who were usually there were two consuls at the same time, and the idea was that they could veto each other so that it would prevent either one of them from becoming a kind of autocrat and having too much power, abusing his power too much. And so Marcus instigated this, but also with Commodus. He planned that Commodus was going to rule jointly, and he actually named his other son, Marcus Annius Verus, as Caesar at the same time that he appointed Commodus Caesar. When they were both round about 5 or 6 years old, they were very young actually. Um, and we're told by one historian that that was done not because Marcus particularly wanted to, but at the behest of Lucius Verus, and presumably at the behest of the Senate as well. So they wanted the succession to be clear very early on, because when there's been confusion about the succession, often that's led to political unrest and uprisings and political purges and so on in Roman history. So I can understand why the Senate would say we want this to be really clear. So we want two Caesars, and we want them named early on. Like this is a strategy for bringing stability to the empire. The other boy died young, unfortunately, and then Commodus was Marcus's only surviving son. But in order to prevent Commodus from becoming sole ruler after Marcus died, Marcus allegedly asked uh, Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, his senior general on the northern frontier, to become Caesar, but he declined for some reason. I could speculate about why he declined, but we're told that he declined. He actually declined multiple times when he was asked to become Caesar. So he was kind of Commodus's mentor and supervisor, so almost like a guardian to him. And Marcus wanted him to really be like an interim ruler and probably a joint ruler alongside Commodus. So the succession plans were quite complex and shifting in the face of the crises that they had to deal with. That's the first thing I'd say. So it's a little bit more complicated, and I think the reason he wanted Commodus to be heir was to avoid this risk of civil war fragmenting the empire.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about the philosophy that so profoundly informed Marcus's life. Now, Stoicism is experiencing a huge revival right now, and you have played a quite significant part in that. You've been writing on Stoicism for over a decade now. For you, since you're continuing to dive into the subject, what do you think is the most valuable thing about Stoicism that your readers are getting by learning about this ancient philosophy?
I think there are two things. I think the reason that people are attracted to Stoicism initially is that it gives them techniques and a philosophy that contributes to emotional resilience and many benefits that go along with that. And then I think people ultimately stay with Stoicism because it gives them the virtue ethic that Stoicism is based upon, gives them a sense of direction and a philosophy of life, sense of purpose, if you like.
Now, at the same time, there's also a lot of antipathy towards Stoicism now. I mean, like all cultural movements that are popular, you also get a reaction against them, and there's the stereotype of the Silicon Valley Stoic bro. Some people call them the Broics. you know, and there's a lot of claims in online discussions and elsewhere that Stoicism is just not suitable for a modern world that cares about social justice and other hot topics. So, um, I guess, yeah, why do you think there is this negative backlash against Stoicism?
I have heard about that. I haven't encountered it all that much, to be honest. I've encountered that a little bit. Um, I'm definitely not a Silicon Valley Stoic, right?
So, like, the first time I ever heard about Marcus
Uh-huh.
Aurelius was when I was in high school, and my mom was watching Law and Order,
Right.
and there was an episode about this petty crime leader, I think in Queens, and he was teaching these young boys
Uh-huh.
to steal bicycles by using liquid nitrogen to like freeze the locks and break them. And of course, like all crime, there's in these movies, they get drawn into some more and more serious things, and then murders happen and so forth. And this guy who teaches the kids to steal bikes, he trains them by having them all read the meditations of
No
Marcus
way.
Aurelius. Okay, and it wasn't so I was like, I don't know, 13,
That's
14 at the
great.
time. Yeah, I was like 13, 14, and it wasn't until graduate school when I read Marcus Aurelius for my PhD that I actually realized that actually this is not a manual for criminals. This is a very humane, philanthropic, brotherly
Yeah.
type of philosophy. So there is quite a bit of a negative feeling towards Stoicism floating around at the same time that it's becoming popular.
I've never heard of that episode of that TV show before. I'd love to see that. It sounds really, you know, kind of interesting. You already know that that's the opposite of everything that Marcus Aurelius teaches. Um, Marcus Aurelius says that the most important virtue is justice, which would, I think, clearly like fly in the face of the life of crime that's being depicted there. Um, yeah, like that. It's I don't know what to say to that because that's obviously not Stoicism. The criticisms that people make are. Do you mean just that some people think that Stoicism is being misrepresented too much, and that when they talk about Broicism and stuff like that, they mean there's like a lot of misreadings of Stoicism or superficial versions of Stoicism. Is that the concern?
I think that's part of it. So I mean, I think part of it is that you have this
Right.
new industry like Stoicism Inc., where people are publishing all these self-help books, and um, they haven't really studied the philosophy in the way that you have done. And but I think also, okay, so if I can partially answer my question in a way that I think might get you to offer your own thoughts, because it's a topic you've written about, uh, moral outrage. Okay, so we love our moral outrage. Um,
Yeah.
you know, tweets that express moral outrage go viral more
Yeah.
than probably any other category. We think it's an integral part of public discourse. I mean, public intellectuals routinely express moral outrage and encourage others to do so. And the Stoics say that any kind of outrage, including so-called moral outrage, is
Uh-huh.
wrong.
Yeah, I agree with the Stoics.
So, I mean, first of all, what do you do? Why is that? Why do you think there's no such thing as true moral outrage?
Because for several reasons. Like first of all, and I have written about this and spoken about it a lot. The Stoics say that anger is temporary madness. There's a belief that many people have that there's such a thing as righteous anger, and that we need anger to kind of motivate us to act against injustice. I think that's one of the most dangerous and toxic beliefs that affects modern society, and I think it's a belief that's causing many problems that we see at the moment in our society. If you're not careful and you allow yourself to indulge in moral outrage, then you potentially become as bad as the person that you're outraged with. Like it's very often the case that the morally outraged becomes the ones that are inflicting injustice on other people in my experience. And the reasons for that, I think the Stoics were aware of this, is that anger, the more intense it is, the more prolonged it is, introduces a whole barrage of cognitive biases into our thinking. they're right that anger is temporary madness. It distorts our thinking. People who are angry think in more overgeneralized terms. They think in dichotomous, black and white terms. They leap to conclusions prematurely, particularly about other people's motives. They underestimate risk, and therefore they tend to place themselves more at risk, and also they place other people around them more at risk than they would be if they weren't angry. And they tend to provoke other people unnecessarily. So you see people getting angry with each other online a lot and kind of provoking each other and just spiraling into this kind of mess of like a back and forth. It destroys civil discourse basically, and it impairs our ability to reason. We know, for instance, in psychology, that it impairs what we call problem solving ability, like problem solving orientation. So people become poorer at solving simple problems when they're angry. If you're trying to fix a leaking tap and you hit your thumb with a hammer and you lose your temper, then you're probably so mad that you kind of find it harder to use the tools and fix a broken tap. But that's an easy thing to fix, right? Like social problems, and particularly like political problems, are much more nuanced and complex and multifaceted. So if we can't even fix a broken tap or something when we've lost our temper, like how much more ham-fisted are we going to be at fixing subtle interpersonal problems? And the Stoics warn us against this. They think we need to learn to transcend our anger and rely more on reason and civil discourse. I think that's something that's really missing from modern society, and that's partly because social media contributes to some of these issues.
But when you make that point, either in writing or in conversations to people, do they accept it or do they fight back?
Some it can go either way. Some people immediately accept it, and some people kind of push back against it. I mean, the main way that people push back against it is usually by saying that they feel they need anger to motivate themselves. And there's a discussion that we can have around whether that's really the case. Like for instance, it's easy to think of counterexamples where people have achieved similar things without having to depend on anger as a source of motivation. So maybe anger does motivate you, but there might be better ways to motivate yourself. Maybe anger does motivate you, but you pay a cost for it. Maybe the cost outweighs the benefits. There's a meme on the internet about drinking coffee that says drink coffee, do stupid things faster and with more energy, right? And this is how I kind of think of this model of anger a bit. It's like get angry, do stupid things faster and with more energy, right? So it motivates you, sure, but what's it motivating you to do? Like if your judgment is clouded and you're activating lots of cognitive biases and things like that, maybe you should be pausing for thought more rather than rushing, headlong into things when you're enraged. So I agree with the Stoics in general that we should be looking at anger and questioning it more.
But why do you think our society loves moral indignation so much? I mean, like, take any superhero movie or really any action movie, right? Almost always the moments
Yeah,
where the protagonist or one of the heroes manages to finally defeat the bad guys, it's almost always by channeling this anger and then like this
yeah,
burst of energy issues forth, and then they finally vanquish. And I think this actually goes back to Virgil's Aeneid, especially the ending, because um, there Aeneas, the protagonist, finally defeats Turnus, the bad guy, and Turnus is on the ground, you know, without unarmed and begging for mercy, and then Aeneas remembers his dead friend, gets angry, and kills him, and that's the end of the book. And it's like that sets a template that we've learned to reuse and reuse throughout modern culture, where anger is the driving force of the hero's vanquishing of the enemy.
yeah. It's a primitive ethic, like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It celebrates revenge. Basically, that's how the Stoics would frame it. They said, yeah, like Greek and Roman society celebrates revenge, like it's part of the traditional values. But the Stoics consider themselves to be radical in questioning that and saying everyone else thinks revenge is a good thing. It's admirable. That's what their heroes do, but we think they're wrong. It's a mistake. Um, I think it's kind of addictive. Like, I think that it because it simplifies our thinking, we get kind of ensnared by it. We get trapped in the lobster trap of tunnel vision. When we are angry, we engage in kind of circular reasoning, like, or confirmation bias. Like, so we're more likely to look for things that justify being angry. The more angry we are, so I think there are reasons why angry people don't see the problem that it's causing for them. It's also of the nature of anger that it biases our thinking so that we tend to attribute blame more to other people. It's what we sometimes call an externalizing emotion. So it's very typical, for whatever reason, that angry people don't seek therapy. They think everyone else needs therapy, right? Anxious and depressed people come in their hordes to therapy and buy self-help
Hmm.
books by the bucket load, but angry people tend not to. They What usually happens is that someone else, their spouse, or if they're in an institution, or like in a prison or in a school or in the military, they might be referred for anger management by somebody else who says, "Hey, buddy, you've got a problem with your anger there." And then they say, "I don't have a problem. It's you guys that have got a problem." Like, but those are the people that sometimes end up getting referred. But anger is a massively undertreated issue for that reason. Because when the angrier people are, the more they tend to think it's other people that have got a problem rather than them. So all of these biases kind of trap people into lacking insight and preventing them from taking responsibility. I think that's part of what's going on.
So just to clarify things for some listeners who might think that we haven't sufficiently argued against the value of moral indignation, I don't think you or the Stoics are saying that you should never feel moral indignation. It's just that when you feel moral anger, you shouldn't act immediately. You should wait, pause, let those thoughts mature, and then act rationally based on the moral sentiments that you, or the moral reasoning that you can get from that.
Basically, I mean, if we want to dig into it a little bit deeper, the fundamental thing about Stoicism is that the Stoics have a cognitive model of emotion. They believe that emotions are thoughts or beliefs, and that's the reason they're so influential today, because that there was a cognitive revolution in psychotherapy in the 1960s, and so modern psychotherapy is actually based on this idea, which was inspired in part by the Stoics, and it's been a very fruitful idea for therapy. It really lies at the origin of modern evidence based practice in therapy. And the Stoics then define anger as the belief that somebody else has committed an injustice and that they deserve to be punished. That's why they say most anger at some level is kind of based on the desire for revenge. And one of the things they challenge that at several levels. They think it's a thinking error. They think there's an error of moral judgment going on here that could be questioned philosophically. And part of it is they think, like, when people get angry, they want to harm the other person. And the Stoics argue that, like, it doesn't really make sense philosophically to harm people that you perceive as committing injustice. Socrates famously followed this argument in Plato's Republic. He said, surely what you would want to do actually is help them. Like, you'd want to enlighten them rather than doing harm to them. Like, your underlying motive, like, should be to convert enemies into friends insofar as that's possible. That would be the most enlightened response, rather than, wanting to hurt them or punish them or harm them as much as possible. And Socrates' argument in the Republic is that if you follow the logic of that desire, what often happens is that you make more enemies, and you make your enemies' hatred of you even more entrenched. Which, like, we can kind of see that happening a lot in the society around us. We can see nations arguably doing that to other countries. It's a source of a lot of ongoing conflict. But that's part of the reason that the Stoics question that. They think we should be questioning what the beliefs are that are and the motives are that are underlying our anger, and that when we do that, we'll kind of see through it and want to replace it with different attitudes.
So we live in this ultra polarized moment right now where members of each side think that the other side is so morally wrong that it's okay to, punch them or whatever.
Yeah.
And the Stoics would say no. The best thing you can do is to kind of win them over rationally. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Crazy idea,
And
huh?
that they're worth
But that,
engaging with rationally.
yeah, yeah, they want to restore civil discourse, and they want us to treat other people with respect, and they want us to. They think we need to. For the Stoics, very much. Um, Although we have books from the Stoics, but the Stoics thought that writing books wasn't the best way to teach. They thought the best way to teach somebody virtue was by modeling it. And so the Stoics would say, look, if you think that someone's, being a bit of an idiot and they're being insulting and irrational, first and foremost, what you have to do is avoid getting provoked into doing that yourself, right? Because when someone calls you names and they're rude and horrible to you, the easiest thing in the world is just to think, oh, I'm just going to do the same thing back. And then we get into this kind of spiral. And the Stoics said, look, the main thing, the initial thing, is not to descend to their level, basically. And if you can exhibit the temperance that's required to rise above that and to control your anger, then to some extent it may be that you'll break the cycle and that the other person will be inspired by that to change the behavior. But certainly it allows you to try engaging them at a more rational level. That's why Marcus Aurelius said the best revenge is to become unlike the other person.
Yeah, so I was actually just going to mention that quote. But see, one thing that sets you apart from any other writer on Stoicism that I know is your background in cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotherapy and all that. And I find it fascinating that this modern type of evidence-based psychotherapy, it was not only inspired by Stoicism, but is so similar to the precepts of Stoicism. So I guess it's weird because I always thought, when I was writing my PhD on Stoicism
That's
and
weird.
even going into it, I thought that the biggest flaw in Stoicism was the Stoic doctrine, really, that all humans are rational through and through, and that when we're irrational, we're just failing, we're
Mhm.
glitching, but like the machine, the mechanism in us is all rational. And I think that
Yeah,
modern modern neuroscience and psychology shows that we're actually not really rational. And yet there is this
yeah,
cognitive behavioral therapy that seems to work. So I mean, how do you
yeah.
assess that?
I don't believe that the Stoics think that we are completely right. Well, I guess it depends how you define what you mean by that. I think the Stoics definitely recognize a place in human nature for irrational um, influences. Like they have the propathei, for example, the proto passions as they call them. Seneca's example is if somebody comes up and pokes their finger in your eye, then you have the blink reflex. He could have said if someone comes up behind you and goes boo, and you jump and your heart rate goes up. You have the startle reflex. So we have these primitive reflex-like responses that form the basis of our emotions and that we share with non-rational animals, non-human animals. So the Stoics recognize that there are animal parts of our nature, there are physical parts of our nature that aren't rational, but they believe that we all have the capacity for reason and that reason plays a special role. They call it the hegemonicon, like the master faculty, because even if we have um, a powerful reflex or an urge to do something, we can potentially take a step back and observe it and decide whether we're going to go along with it or whether we're going to try and resist it. So the Stoics say, reason isn't all powerful, but it gives us the capacity for self consciousness and the ability to evaluate our physical drives and instincts and reflexes in a way perhaps that other animals aren't capable of doing. And that idea people made the same kind of criticism, I suppose, of cognitive therapy. And cognitive therapy would be defended in the same way. Cognitive therapists aren't saying that reason is all powerful, only that it potentially plays a key role.
Yeah, I mean that's all really interesting, but let me rephrase, or let me, I guess, clarify what I meant by all rational. So, you know, you have someone like Plato before the Stoics who theorized that, much like Freud, that the psyche has multiple parts. It's got two non-rational parts and the rational part, and the rational part is by nature the weakest and therefore must be strengthened in order to prevail over the other two parts. And the Stoics come and say, no, the soul is a uncompounded entity. It's one thing, doesn't have different parts. It's basically like a rational computer, but it doesn't actually operate rationally unless it's trained to the point of being a sage. So there still is this idea that there's a that humans are profoundly rational, and that's their most defining characteristic, and that's why all humans are bound by the same moral law. And that's why we're all citizens of the same community, and we're all brothers and sisters of each other, and so forth.
Yeah.
Do you find that to hold up to modern psychology?
Yeah, I do.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Plato's tripartite model of the soul. I don't think it's entirely Plato's fault. This idea comes from Greek culture and other cultures in more general terms. But this was a problem in psychology, and I think from the 1950s approximately onwards, people began to question this idea that there was a faculty of the emotions and a faculty of reason, and there were two separate things. Like, we made a lot of progress in psychology, and particularly in psychotherapy, when people began to question this kind of fragmentation of the mind. And we saw in particular, in my field in psychotherapy, like cognitive therapy is based on this idea that emotions are much more cognitive than people assumed before. It's common sense to people that there's reason here and there's emotion there, and they're two separate things. And it seems odd in cognitive therapy when we say to people, well, maybe your feelings are thoughts. Albert Ellis, the original pioneer of cognitive therapy, he said that when he was assessing clients, the clients in therapy will typically sit in the consulting room and they'll talk about their anger, their anxiety, or their depression, and how it's causing them health problems and how it's affecting their work and their relationships and so on. And basically, they give themselves lots of reasons to want to change. And then they usually reach a point, maybe far into the session, where they express what we call stuckness sometimes. So they'll say, I can't help this, it's just how I feel. So I know my depression is ruining my life, I know that my anger is causing all these problems, but I can't help it, it's just how I feel. And Ellis very simply used to break through that by leaning forward and smiling and saying, yeah, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think. And opening up this radical idea, really, that thoughts and feelings aren't two completely separate faculties, that our feelings are cognitive in nature. Because as soon as we recognize that, we can open up a whole toolbox of cognitive therapy techniques, which now, I mean, to put it very crudely, have proven efficacy. Like cognitive therapy, came on leaps and bounds and made a lot of progress because we discovered that a lot of the cognitive techniques that we give people actually do work. And they are able to take more control of their emotions when they view them from that perspective.
Wow, I've like a whirlwind of thoughts, and I don't know how to respond exactly. But so let me just, full disclosure, I am a fan of Plato's tripartite model. I think it's a very good model. I think it's largely true. And I just had John Vervaeke on the show a while ago, and his
Uh-huh.
view of Plato's tripartite model is that Plato and Freud and many others, he's done like a whole history of human thought. He thinks that this truth
Yeah.
has been rediscovered again and again throughout civilization. I'm a fan of Dostoevsky and how he kind of examines the subconscious processes that lead people to have thoughts that they don't understand why they got to. Now, at the same time, I I recognize the efficacy of
Right.
cognitive behavioral therapy and of Stoicism. So I think both the Stoics and modern psychotherapists have realized that you can use language and thinking as an interface with your mind to affect your emotions. But that doesn't mean that your emotions are bubbling up through a rational process, right?
Well, no, but I think it's clear that most of our emotions are heavily cognitively mediated. to use the terminology that we usually use in modern psychology. By the way, as an aside, I'd be very interested to see what John Vervaeke has to say about the history of psychotherapy and how it relates to that model, because it's one of my particular areas of interest, but I haven't had a chance to see what he says about that. So, of course, like I said earlier, we have the propathei. So we do have these aspects of our nature that the Stoics would consider to be part of our animal nature. But most of it, like the bulk of what goes on in our emotional life is already like heavily laden with cognition. It's full of assumptions. It's shaped by our style of thinking, by cognitive schemas that are activated, by the way that we conceptualize the stimuli and the objects that surround us. We live in a world that's like completely pervaded with cognition by thoughts, beliefs, assumptions. And so we have these stimuli that originate in our body. Like, say somebody comes up and they yell boo behind us, right? And they trigger the startle reflex. That's not inherently cognitive in nature, but pretty quickly, like we start interpreting it. So pretty fast, like within a second or so, like we'll decide whether that's a signal of danger or it's just one of our mates playing a trick on us or something like that. And the way that we would then respond would be determined by our values and our judgments, and whether we think, if someone plays a trick on us and does that, whether we think that's acceptable or whether it's unacceptable. So I'd say there is, even in the cognitive model of anxiety, we recognize that there are these stimuli that are in a sense, non-cognitive or precognitive in nature. But the role that they play in our lives is heavily cognitively mediated. And that's why cognitive therapy places so much emphasis on.
Well, when you say cognitive, I think that's a richer term than rational in the Stoic sense. So let's just limit our discussion for the sake of keeping it under control to rational, that is reasoning through sentences, syllogisms, etc. So the Stoics believe that emotions consist in propositional content in the brain. Okay, now I know that you're not like a big fan of Jung based on your other conversations with other, on YouTube and elsewhere, but I think that one thing Jung did show with his thousands of hours of analyses of people's dreams, etc., is that we can think systematically. Our brain can engage in a systematic processing and sequence of symbols and of meaning, and that can be all systematic and analyzable, but it's not operating through sentences and syllogisms in the way that the Stoics think, right? And then just another point, I'm sure you've heard of the metaphor of the monkey sitting on the tiger's back, and the tiger runs around and the monkey says, oh, I went there for this reason, I went there for that reason, kind of backwards rationalizing what the tiger is doing. And the tiger represents the unconscious and the monkey represents our kind of rational consciousness. So like, I guess, do you really think that and the Stoics would say, no, the monkey is in control, but isn't there a tiger there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't buy that metaphor as an accurate analogy for how human nature functions in a sense. And also in regarding Jung's research on dreams and so on, I don't consider it to be, it's pre-scientific in a sense in relation to the field of psychology, is at least in the way that he conducted that research. So I'm not sure what conclusions we can draw from. I love Jung's books. I think they're really fascinating, but I kind of treat them more like theology than as psychology. So I'm not. First of all, I'm not really sure how much we can attribute scientifically to the claims that Jung makes about dreams, or Freud, or any other people that write about dream analysis. Could we separate propositional content from the symbolic meaning of dreams? I guess I just find that hard to conceptualize. It seems to me that there's a combination that's going on, like the dreams have a symbolic meaning, but that's completely pervaded by propositional content, by assumptions and belief, reason in the Stoic sense, by syllogistic logic that pervades all of that, and the interpretation that we place on the dreams almost immediately starts to employ something resembling syllogistic reasoning. We think about how it applies to our lives and so on, and what the consequences of like interpreting a dream in a particular way or acting on it a certain way might be. So I think we are, like the Stoics say, in my opinion, very much creatures that employ reason. This analogy of I mean, I feel like, gosh, I don't really know what to make of the analogy with the tiger. It's not really how I see the mind. I guess what would be, I'm trying to think of a way that I could compare it to a particular situation.
Well, I mean, setting aside Jung and the tiger for a second, right? I mean, there are tons of people in your field and in neuroscience who are of the opinion that
Yes.
Consciousness and reason play a minuscule role in our decision making, right? So that's still an open question, I guess.
Define minuscule. Like they even the Stoics might be able to recognize that there are other factors that play a role in our decision making, but the role that reason plays is somehow special or important. That we, for example, in cognitive therapy, we recognize that there are these unconscious or non conscious factors that influence our behavior, but still those then are affected by our subsequent reasoning. Um, so it might be, for example, it might be a conditioned reflex that causes anxiety to arise, or some other non-conscious factor. But very quickly we have a decision about how we then respond to that anxiety, or how we interpret that anxiety. And I think what's clear from cognitive therapy is that that we can take control over our feelings, and that we can have a very profound effect on them by the way that we subsequently choose to respond, the what we say to ourselves, like the way that we employ reason.
Well, I mean, I must admit, I'm a little surprised and also thrilled that you are, such a staunch defender of Stoicism in the light of modern psychotherapy. So,
Yeah, well,
um,
it's cognitive therapy. We have to use cognition, um, and we use Socratic questioning. I guess in a sense, we're using syllogistic reasoning in a way when we use Socratic questioning, as it's called, with clients. Um, so, like working with the clients' thought processes is bread and butter of the therapy. We do non-cognitive processes with clients as well. But a big part of what we do is helping clients to change their relationship with their thinking and question their beliefs and assumptions. And when we do that, we find that it has a big effect on the emotions, even if a lot of the things that originally contributed to the emotions were to do with conditioning, or even the biochemistry of the body, or other non cognitive factors.
so the Stoics, and like most ancient philosophers, claim that philosophy is the medicine of the soul, and I guess modern psychotherapists, a lot of them would say that cognitive therapy is the medicine of the soul, or at least one of the medicines of the soul. Now, the Stoics compiled in a really impressive toolkit of maxims, exercises, routines, all those things of how to kind of train yourself to have better, healthier, more rational responses to the various stimuli and events that happen in your life. And they claim that by undergoing such training, by repeating these things to yourselves, by examining your thoughts in these ways, etc., you will be a happier person. And I guess modern cognitive behavioral therapy does a lot of the same stuff as well. Now I'm curious, has it verified, like has cognitive behavioral therapy verified most of Stoicism? Is there anything that it found to be wrong about Stoicism? Is there anything that it offers that's way better than a departure from Stoicism? Like how closely does it track Stoicism?
Well, that's a better way of putting the question. I think I'd be the first person to say that Stoicism and CBT are not like the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Cognitive therapy, though, shares one of the fundamental assumptions of Stoicism, this kind of cognitive model of emotion. And from that, it kind of inevitably means that it arrives at some similar conclusions, not identical conclusions, but some similar sounding conclusions. And it comes up with some similar strategies, although some of the strategies are kind of different. And then actually, in some cases, it's a little bit difficult to make a direct comparison because, when we're dealing with classics, the Stoics, because of the way that they articulate their philosophy, um, sometimes it's vague. They're using kind of poetic language, if you like. Sometimes they just articulate things in a way that's slightly different from the way that we would in our culture. Sometimes they describe techniques but kind of leave out key details. So it's not really clear how closely it matches what we might do in modern cognitive therapy. But then there's other areas where often what ends up happening is we can go, this thing that the Stoics say sounds a lot like something that we do in cognitive therapy that we know works. It's difficult for us to say 100% for sure that they definitely meant the same thing, but it definitely sounds very similar. But it's not surprising when you're working with the classics that sometimes you have to attach these slight caveats. Like they may possibly have meant something different. It sounds like they mean what we're saying today.
Yeah, well, people tend to forget or are unaware that when we say the Stoics, we mean something like 500 or 600 years of philosophers. So they're collecting tons of
Yeah.
empirical data, even if it doesn't live up to,
Yes.
modern evidence-based research. I would call it evidence-based personally, but that's just my own judgment. But is there anything that modern psychotherapy thinks is wrong about the Stoic version of the medicine for the soul?
What would be a good criticism? The Yeah, all right. I'll give you one good example, but I can't even say for certainty that the Stoics got this wrong. The Stoics say they have this technique called premeditatio malorum that involves visualizing. It's a good analogy. Like clearly, they have a technique that involves visualizing feared events in the future as if they're happening now. And a number of authors describe this. In particular, they visualize the prospect of their own death. They visualize poverty, exile, and so on. And this definitely sounds like stuff that we do in modern therapy, but perhaps particularly in the cognitive behavioral tradition, although not exclusively so. What complicates that analogy is that there are maybe like 6 different potential reasons why you might want to visualize a future event. So there are different psychological mechanisms and strategies that might come into play when you're doing that. And it's a little unclear which ones the Stoics are employing. Um, so the most important one is actually emotional habituation, as we call it. That's probably the most robust process in the field of modern psychotherapy. And so we know that when people expose themselves in reality to something that they fear, a feared stimulus, if they do it for long enough and repeatedly enough, their anxiety will tend to abate naturally. So, say somebody has a phobia for dogs, if they are in a room with dogs, they'll get really anxious. But if they wait, their heart rate will gradually slow down and their anxiety will begin to wear off. And if they keep going back and doing this, like within a few weeks or so, or less, like their anxiety will reduce permanently. And the Stoics seem to be aware of this. Other ancient authors actually are a little bit clearer about it. It's the most obvious rationale for repeatedly visualizing things in the future. Um, but it's not the one that we would expect them to emphasize, partly because it's like more of a non-cognitive process, arguably. Um, what we'd expect them to put more emphasis on, and what they seem to put more emphasis on, would be rehearsing alternative ways of thinking about the field event, and also perhaps what we call gaining cognitive distance. So, separating our value judgments from the external event that they apply to. So, becoming more aware, if you like, of how our thoughts are shaping our emotional response to the thing that we're visualizing. I think that's probably what the Stoics had in mind. They may have a combination of these processes in mind when they describe that technique. If we had a time machine and went back and saw exactly how they did it, we might think, oh, they're not doing that quite the way that we would today. I'll give you an example. We now know that if you visualize a feared event, if you don't do it for long enough, it could potentially increase your sensitization to the phobic stimulus. So it could be that the ancient Stoics knew that this technique worked, but maybe they didn't realize that they had to do it for such a prolonged period of time. And in that case, we might go back and we might say, okay, we would suggest doing that slightly differently. I mention that because I think when modern self-help writers, this would be a criticism of modern Stoicism, by the way. When modern writers about Stoicism talk about that technique, they don't really acknowledge that visualizing feared events could sometimes be harmful, and there might be a number of psychological factors that we'd want to consider to make sure that it doesn't backfire. And one of them would be the amount of time that we expose ourselves to the feared image for.
Okay, so let me see if I got this right. So premeditatio malorum, the premeditation, the thinking ahead of these bad things that will happen to you, right? That's an exercise of the Stoics. And you're saying that modern psychotherapists find, I think, two issues with that. Number one, if you don't do it right, if you don't do it persistently enough, you could actually increase your fear as opposed to the desired effect of becoming numb to the fear. And the second one is that there are alternatives, such as thinking of different things you could do, to have a better outcome.
There could be other things that the Stoics haven't mentioned that would be.
That's not a very scathing critique of Stoicism.
Actually, it's quite a strong. It is quite a scathing critique of modern books on Stoicism. It's
Okay.
it's quite a serious problem. Well, you were mentioned earlier of this idea of kind of broicism and so on. Maybe there are more superficial interpretations of the Stoics, right? There is potentially quite a serious risk there that some of the self-help strategies that are drawn from Stoicism could actually be doing more harm than good. To me, that's a pretty serious criticism.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, for sure. I mean, and actually, one thing I find lacking in the modern Stoic discussions of premeditatio malorum is the larger philosophical picture. So, modern Stoics and Broics, they present Stoicism as if it's just a self-help philosophy, and in reality, it's an entire worldview.
Right.
And you bring this out in your book, How to Think Like an Emperor. But it's not just self-help. It's not just training your emotions. It's understanding the world and your place in it, and even physics according to the ancient view, etc. And I think that what maybe one reason why the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum doesn't jive with modern cognitive therapy is that modern people in America and Scotland and other places, we don't have this view of a ordered providential cosmos where all disasters are actually part of the natural functioning of the universe, and we should therefore welcome or at least accept all misfortunes that happen, because they're not actually misfortunes. It's just how the world unfolds. So we don't subscribe to that, most people. So that also might be why the therapists don't subscribe to it.
Possibly. I think we can detach that to some. This is a controversial thing to say among people who are really interested in Stoicism from a philosophical perspective. But I think the Stoic belief in providence isn't popular with most of the people that read books on Stoicism today. Even many of the academics that are interested in Stoicism and kind of like look favorably on it don't necessarily buy into the Stoic theology. And I think to some extent we can divorce Stoicism from some of those theological beliefs. And I don't think that would even be a completely unheard of idea in the ancient world. For example, in the Meditations, about 9 times, Marcus Aurelius, so like over and over again, Marcus Aurelius brings up this idea that scholars sometimes call the God or atoms argument, where he's kind of comparing the providential view that the Stoics have to this view that's more characteristic of the atomists and the Epicureans, that the universe is just caused by the random collision of atoms rather than the design of the gods. And his point is that he believes that many of the Stoic core moral teachings can be justified either way, whether or not somebody believes in God or whether they believe in atoms. And this argument goes beyond Marcus Aurelius, actually. I think we find it referred to in Seneca as well. But in addition to that, there are other reasons why I think this wouldn't be a completely alien concept to ancient philosophers. They were all familiar with the idea of atheism and agnosticism, and they'd heard about criticisms of the concept of providence. So it wouldn't shock them if they came today and we said we don't believe that, but we quite like some of your other ideas. I think they would, at the very least, say, "Oh yeah, we've heard of guys like you. You know, we've had similar debates in the past with Cynic philosophers, for example, or others, or the Epicureans who didn't really share our theological beliefs." So I think they'd be down with that. I was going to say for a second there that in some ways I might even be I may even be able to make a more scathing critique of modern Stoicism than you were perhaps implying. I'm starting to think in this conversation. Maybe I'm more critical of Broicism than I might have seemed at first. So, what I would say is slightly different from what you're talking about, but I think it's related. Is that there's a lot of emphasis on Stoicism today as just a kind of emotional coping style, and kind of completely divorced from the ethics and stuff, right? It's just about being a tough guy for some people, right? And in some ways, that's just a complete caricature. Like some of the people who really interpret Stoicism in that way may, in my experience, like literally haven't even read Marcus Aurelius or any books on the subject. They've just kind of vaguely heard of the concept of Stoicism, and they're kind of mixing it up in their mind with the idea of lowercase Stoicism, the what we mean in psychological research today by Stoicism with a lowercase s, just as unemotional coping style where people kind of conceal or repress unpleasant emotions. And the ancient Stoics would have said that controlling your emotions and developing resilience and these kind of things aren't necessarily virtues. Unless they're done in the service of wisdom and justice. Then, the point that Socrates made, in which the Stoics, I believe, are cognizant of, is that, in a sense, a criminal a murderer or a thief might exhibit self-discipline and courage, or at least might be perceived as exhibiting those traits. But they wouldn't have the virtue of courage or the virtue of self-discipline unless they were doing it in the service of wisdom and justice. So I think the criticism that Socrates and the Stoics would make is that some of the modern articles and discussions that you see around Stoicism, where people say if you toughen up and become more Stoic, you can become more successful at your career, or something like that. But it's not really connected to a moral worldview. That would remind them of this argument that these characteristics in themselves aren't inherently virtuous. They only become so when they're wedded to a commitment to a deeper sense of moral action.
Wow. Well, again, flurry of thoughts. This opens up a huge can of worms about whether you need providence or God for the Stoic system, and you seem to think that a lot of it is salvageable even without that. And I think that from a therapeutic perspective, that's probably true. But from a philosophical perspective, I don't think it's true. I think I've had this conversation. I mean, I've talked about this with other people on my podcast, but I think that if you look at the passages where Marcus Aurelius has I think you called it the God or atoms or providence or atoms argument, the idea that whether or not that, either the world is providentially ordered or it's just a bunch of random atoms, combining and separating in different ways. And either way, you should not, act bad. You should not fret. You should accept what happens. Okay. But it's always that argument is always used, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. It's always used with the conclusion, therefore, like, accept what happens and don't complain and whine about it. It's never used to further a claim about justice or about what you should actively do for the good of the community. And I think that that's where Stoicism really needs providence in order to advocate. Again, this is probably beyond.
I'll be honest with you, I can't
Yeah.
remember. I remember that there are 9 references
Yeah.
to it. Yeah, I'll be honest and tell you that off the top of my head, I can't remember whether any of them are related to justice or not. But I think that's an interesting point. I think one of the questions that I'd raise, and I won't pretend to have an answer to this, but certainly in relation to this debate, if you like, one of the questions that comes to my mind is, if you believe that removing providence causes Stoic ethics to collapse, that it depends completely on providence, to what extent are there other ethical systems that we can justify philosophically without reference to providence? Is the Stoic system inherently more vulnerable to that criticism than alternative ethical philosophies, particularly in the ancient world? And also, there are other people who have very similar ethical positions in ancient philosophy to the Stoics. For example, Socrates and the Cynics have not identical, but similar, comparable ethical views that are less directly linked to belief in providence. The Cynics are usually characterized as kind of agnostic, or at least as not particularly interested in theology. But the Stoics hold them up as moral role models. They actually believe that they are exemplars of what they mean by moral virtue, despite the fact that they don't share their belief in providence.
Well, here I would actually take issue with what you said, because I think Socrates was profoundly influenced by a sense of divine providence. Both Xenophon and Plato portray him as saying such things. And the Cynics, it's hard to know what they thought, but we have very few sources. And according to Epictetus, the Cynics were almost like Jesus type figures. They had this the call to cynicism. Like there's a discourse of Epictetus called like answering the call to become a cynic, and it's almost like a religious experience where you renounce the world and you become a kind of monk, and you love the people who abuse you, and you just give everything to humanity, and you believe that this is somehow for a higher purpose. So I think those two examples are equally dependent on an idea of providence. But I will give you that the Epicureans had almost identical teachings in many cases with the Stoics, but without the presence of God there. So I guess your argument still stands in the end.
Well, I'd love to talk more about that, because I think it'd be an interesting conversation. But the other example I was going to give was Aristoteleios, who was one of the followers of Zeno and was considered a renegade Stoic, but is still referred to by subsequent authors as a Stoic, and said that he had no conception of God. We don't know a lot about Aristotle's philosophy, but it sounds like he was an agnostic. That's usually how he's interpreted. And he had an ethic that's somewhere between Stoicism and Cynicism.
And he was kind of excommunicated, right, if you will, from the Stoic, lineup of great writers. All right, so we could go on. I mean, I think we have grounds here for a second conversation if you want to come back on the show. But for now, I'm cognizant of your time. So your book, Verissimus, about a graphic novel about Marcus Aurelius, is just out. I'm excited to get my copy. It's still in the mail. In a few words, just tell our listeners, what they can expect to find in this new book.
Well, it kind of ended up looking a bit like a prequel to Gladiator, but with more philosophy in it. I think that wasn't necessarily intentional, but maybe it was inevitable. Like once we started to give it a kind of cinematic look. So it's the life story of Marcus Aurelius. It follows pretty closely the historical sources that we have, and it tells his story, I guess, from a slightly different perspective, in that it puts a lot more emphasis on the role of philosophy in his life. And so we try really hard to take passages from the Meditations and think about situations where Marcus might have actually been having those thoughts in relation to the events that were unfolding around him. So we try to weave his, in a way, we have for Marcus these kind of, broadly speaking, two types of sources. We've got the meditations, which describe his inner thoughts, and then we have these Roman histories and other bits that describe his outward life as Roman emperor. And in a sense, what we're trying to do in the graphic novel is connect them and weave them together. And I think that gives the reader maybe more of a sense of how Stoicism might have influenced his actions as emperor, but hopefully it also gives them more of a sense of how his Stoic reflections related to day-to-day events in his everyday life, and maybe I think that gives them a little bit more inspiration about how they could take some of those ideas and apply them to their own daily life.
Fantastic. Well, I will add that based on the samples I've seen online, the artwork is phenomenal. It's historically very accurate, and I know that you did years of research with your artist to get all the details of the swords and the clothing and the locations right. So, highly recommend it. Thank you,
Yeah,
Donald Robertson, for coming on the show.
thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.